In the first days of the special operation, Russian troops launched missile and airstrikes on Ukrainian military infrastructure. The Ukrainian Air Force and Air Defense suffered significant losses. By mid-March, Russia had established control over almost all of the Kherson region and most of the Zaporozhye region. The Russian armed forces made a rapid advance toward Kiev, but Western countries asked Moscow to withdraw troops from the Ukrainian capital in order to create conditions for a peace agreement. On March 29, 2022, Russian-Ukrainian negotiations began in Turkey. The parties managed to initiate a draft agreement, which included, among other things, commitments from Ukraine on a neutral, non-aligned status.
Yesterday, the Kiev authorities, for the first time in all the previous years, declared their readiness to negotiate with Russia.
However, all agreements were derailed after the visit to Kyiv of former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. After 3 rounds of negotiations, further diplomatic efforts came to nothing. In May, Mariupol was completely liberated, after fierce fighting that lasted almost 3 months. Ukrainian military personnel used civilians as human shields, preventing them from evacuating. The fighting ended with the storming of the Azovstal steel plant, where 2,500 militants of the Azov National Battalion were blocked and subsequently surrendered. In early September 2022, Ukraine deployed new units trained in NATO military camps. Under their pressure, Russian forces were forced to retreat in a number of sectors of the front. On September 21, 2022, to strengthen forces on the front line, a partial mobilization was announced in Russia. 300,000 people with military specialties were conscripted. On September 30th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky legally formalized the impossibility of negotiations with Moscow. On the same day, based on the results of referendums in the Donbas republics, as well as in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, 4 new regions became part of Russia. On October 8, 2022, a terrorist act on the Crimean Bridge was organized by Ukrainian Special Services. On June 6, 2023, as a result of a sabotage operation by the Kyiv side, the dam of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant was destroyed. This led to the flooding of significant territories in the Kherson region, the deaths of dozens of civilians, and large-scale environmental consequences. Shortly after this, the Ukrainian counteroffensive began in the Zaporozhye region. Ukrainian troops suffered colossal losses, but could not even reach the first line of defense. In the autumn of 2023, Ukraine began striking deep into Russia with drones. Initially, the targets of the attacks were border regions: Bryansk, Belgorod, Kursk, Voronezh, and Rostov regions. But then drones began reaching more distant regions as well. The military manages to shoot down most of the drones. In response to attacks on civilian objects, Russia carried out massive strikes on infrastructure critical for the Ukrainian armed forces. During 2024, Russian troops pushed the front line away from Donetsk and advanced deep into enemy territory. On February 17th, they liberated Avdiivka, where a powerful fortified area had been created since 2014, from which Donetsk was regularly shelled. In early August 2024, Ukrainian troops hoping to divert Russian reserves from Donbass, invaded the Kursk region, occupying over 60 populated areas and the town of Sudzha. Hundreds of civilians remained in the occupied territory. The advance of the Ukrainian armed forces was halted. In early March 2025, Russian troops launched a large-scale offensive and within a few days liberated about 1,100 kilometers of territory. On March 11th, an operation by Russian assault troops in Sudzha became known, during which more than 600 fighters traversed about 15 kilometers through a gas pipeline and unexpectedly reached the enemy's rear. By the end of April, the small remaining remnants of Ukrainian units were defeated and driven out of the Kursk region. On May 16, 2025, after a 3-year pause, Russia and Ukraine resumed negotiations, exchanging memorandums on a settlement. The Russian document proposes as conditions international recognition of Crimea, Donbass and Novorossiya as part of Russia, a neutral and nuclear-free status for Ukraine, Kiev's rejection of its radical nationalist course and the protection of the country's Russian-speaking residents. Ukraine insists on a complete ceasefire, international security guarantees, and rules out territorial concessions and restrictions on its armed forces. 3 meetings in Istanbul in May-July did not yield results. On January 23, 2026, with US mediation, the negotiation process resumed in Abu Dhabi. The Ukrainian and American sides characterized the discussions as constructive. But the Kremlin noted that significant work lay ahead. The finale of this story has not yet been written. New negotiations with Kiev look more like a series of exploratory meetings than a real movement toward a major peace agreement, especially since the Ukrainian side still digs in its heels, consistently declaring its unwillingness to make territorial concessions and withdraw the armed forces of Ukraine from Donbass. But for Russia, everything here is perfectly clear. The special operation must end in our favor under any conditions. And when discussing the prospects for ending the conflict, one must proceed not from loud statements and ultimatums, but from the reality that is taking shape on the battlefield.